So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Çatalhöyük.
Thank you, Brandon. All right, so this is going to be a bit of a mix of material that I worked on for my PhD, ideas that I've been working on since the PhD, and some ideas that I'm working on for the current Leverhulme project that I hope to just give a very brief introduction to at the very end of the presentation. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of ideas that are all scrambled up in my head together into these slides. If anything's not clear or if I completely lose the plot, please don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask for clarification or anything. So essentially what I want to talk about today is how we connect concepts of politics in archaeology to what we do with excavated architecture, what we do with epistemologically with architecture, and particularly to try to move away from a view of politics as something that happens in powerful institutions, kind of above the pay grade of anyone here, into something that's much more distributed through the worlds that we live in and that we all have a little bit more of a handle in. Someone joining, should I? Okay, cool. So yes, that's the idea. So I'll start by talking about the idea of politics as the operation of powerful institutions that I think is baked into a lot of the ways that we put together narratives in archaeology. I'll talk about some of the issues that brings up when we start puzzling out prehistoric houses, and then walk through some of the prehistoric houses that I've spent quite a while now puzzling over, and why I think that this sort of institutional model of what political life in the past was like starts to break down when you look at houses closely enough. Then I'll suggest kind of framing that material in a different model of what politics is, one that's more embedded in practice, coming from the anthropologist of medicine, among many hats that she wears, Anne-Marie Moll, who calls it ontological politics, her idea of what we can do with practice. Then right at the end, I'll talk a little bit about where I'm hoping to go with these ideas next, moving into my current Leverhulme project. So I thought I'd start with a narrative that should sound really very familiar to just about everyone in the room. In the beginning, there were hunter-gatherers, right? They lived in small communities, bands, some might call them, and they did most of their activities in small groups, very communally, very socially. They built shelters rather than houses, we often talk about them. And most of the activities in hunter-gatherer life were in undifferentiated open space in their camps, in their temporary little settlements. So hunter-gatherer politics is really very simple, and the connections between people are modulated mostly individual to individual through things like kinship. However, once we get to the Neolithic, people start putting down roots. They start building more substantial dwellings out of mud, brick, and stone, and they start moving a lot of the things that they do in their lives from the kind of communal space outside of houses into buildings themselves. Once people start bringing practice inside four walls, maybe they start to develop more close, more intimate connections with the other people that they share those four walls with. Then they share connections with their neighbors, the people down the street, so on and so forth. In other words, maybe this is the origin of the household. So the idea of a household is that, like I said, people are more intimately connected with the people that they share a structure with than they are with other people. And you get, you don't have to read all of the quotes that I put up here on screen, but I hope you can see that in a real range of theoretical positions, a real time span, archaeologists have thought about Neolithic communities as fundamentally made up of households, and so you think about households as being bonded by these shared practices, as having a shared kind of domestic strategy to navigate these emerging agricultural lifeways, as having goals to steward and transmit resources, both material and symbolic, through the generations, from person to person, parent to child to grandchild, and so on. And so once we have these settled communities made up of these little institutions, these households, and every Neolithic settlement is a set of households, then the question quite naturally arises, okay, at what point do households start to become different from one another? At what point do households start to have more wealth, have more possessions, have more prestige? At what point do certain groups or certain households start to stand out in the social landscape as perhaps leaders in the community or as subsidiary people in the community? Is this in the Neolithic, if we can perceive differences from one house to the next, one household to the next, is this perhaps the seeds, the very nascent little bit of inequality that grows into wealth disparities, class elites, and ultimately institutions like the state that are founded upon that? So this narrative, I hope, is familiar to just about everyone. It's something that most of us will have encountered in our first year archaeology primers, Archaeology 101 or something like that. Now, a big overarching grand narrative like this is low-hanging fruit for critique. I don't want to pick through and go very hard against all of this. I'm sure just about every archaeology working in prehistory today would have some sense that things are much more complicated than what I just presented. But it is still a kind of structuring narrative behind a lot of the research agenda, particularly in Neolithic society. And what I want to develop is the idea that that narrative rests on an implicit model of what politics is, how politics works, and how we investigate politics using excavated materials. So this is, I think, if aliens came down and abducted a news kiosk and using the things that we write about politics in our newspapers came up with a definition of what we meant by it, they'd come up with something a little bit like this. So politics is about the operation of institutions, and those institutions are organized, and the higher up on this ranking we go, the more political the things that people in those positions do are, the more consequential it is. I think, not to bring him into it, but Donald Trump with his service to the public as only I can fix your society. And it is very much capturing that idea that powerful institutions, political institutions, are where real meaningful change can originate. And by converse, the closer we get to the space, the less political, the less consequential decisions and events become. That's actually baked into that narrative that I just traced, that Archaeology 101 sort of narrative. That history is a series of emergences of successively more elite, successively more complex institutions from which power emanates, from which change emanates. And that the interesting thing in each period of history is looking at the emergence of the next level up that ladder of institutional power. So that very early Neolithic period sees a lot of investigation of how do households work, how do households form in the first place. Household archaeology is a really big conversation for a lot of people working in the very earliest Neolithic. But then once you get into later Neolithic periods, once you get into the post-Neolithic, the color paper that I put up earlier that kind of take as a baseline assumption about societies that they're organized into households. And the interesting thing is how those households are ranked, whether those households support elite institutions. past that earliest Neolithic. These things, kinship, the household, even some sense of differentiation between people becomes sort of a fait accompli. And archaeologists tend to assume that these things simply are there and that we can use that about politics and decision-making and change coming from institutions, is that archaeology becomes very much a search for proxies or the material footprints of these institutions. So if I'm looking to understand the political structure of households in somewhere like Çatalhöyük, which is in southeast Turkey, then maybe I look at this plan and say, all right, I've got these squiggly things are all domestic structures with interesting squiggly foundations to them. So maybe each of those is actually the material representation or the material footprint of a household. And the things that I excavate within that building tell me about the character of that household institution. We have this building that's not domestic here, that has no evidence of day-to-day life in it. And maybe that tells us about larger encompassing institutions that are helping to organize that community and put those households in relation to one another. And you get quite a lot of back and forth in particularly Neolithic Southwest Asia about how these often quite bizarre forms of architecture, I mean, those are weird houses, right? These bizarre forms of architecture were organized into institutions, and where are the households, where are the groups of households, where are the religious sodalities, and so on and so forth? How can we kind of draw a circle on a settlement plan around some structures or one structure and say everything within this is an institution? And I think that that is just a little bit of a jump, right? For one thing, I don't think there's actually that good evidence that households are a universal organizational principle for human societies to the extent that we can see a domestic structure archaeologically and make quite a lot of pretty profound assumptions about the way that that structure and the people in it worked as a political group to jump to the conclusion that that is a household. I quite like this article by Margot Russell, who says that households are a regulatory ideal, drawing the Judith Butler idea of regulatory ideals into this. It's a concept that people have of what life might look like, that might help them think about how to act. But it's very rarely a descriptive reality. If you think of an ideal household, how many of us actually have completely unrelated people living with us? How many of us have breakups, flat shares, all kinds of mess in our households that works perfectly fine in day-to-day life, even if we have some concept in our society of that we all live in households. In fact, we all have to define our household on tax forms every now and then. But at a deeper level, I think that that kind of institutional model of politics, the idea that studying politics in the past is about looking at how different institutions articulate to form a society, to build up a society from building blocks like households, misses a lot of the potential in the stuff that we excavate. In many ways from a pre-established baseline of relationships that are already more or less set in stone, that once you have built a house and assembled some people to live there, that those relationships very quickly become a little bit unproblematized, a little bit, done with, and those people can act now as a unit. So what I want to suggest, and I'll come back to this after I've gone through some of my data, which will help to talk about these ideas. But what I want to suggest is that we can think about other models of politics that situate politics much more close to ground level, that situate politics and the things that people do with their lives, really moment to moment, day to day, and that make little things like cooking dinner or going to bed into actually kind of political acts at the full meaning of politics, not as something petty and confined to household politics, but as politics writ large. So I'm taking inspiration from Anne-Marie Moll, who, as I said, wears many hats, but one of them is as an ethnographer of medical practice. So Moll's work is on bodies, not houses, and I'm porting these ideas across from quite a different theoretical context. She works in hospitals, and certainly not in Neolithic dwellings, but porting this idea of politics out of her work into the way that I'm thinking about houses in Neolithic Turkey. So Moll's idea about politics, what she calls ontological politics, is that politics is baked into the way that we even understand what there is to be seen in our world and what we can do with it in the first place. So she's embedded in some hospitals in the Netherlands and is looking at how hospitals decide what's going to become of a person who walks in those doors. She says hospitals have a whole lot of different ways that they can understand what's going on in a person's body, what could happen with that person's body. Interview the person, understand what symptoms they have. We can take a blood sample or surgery. Each of these different practices helps people in medical context to understand what that human body is doing and what it's capable of doing in the future as well. And the critical insight that Moll has is that as people are doing that, they are not just trying to come to an adequate description of what they're looking at, they're thinking through what could happen to this person that they're trying to treat. And the second thing is that not all these interventions need to necessarily fit together really nicely. I think we've all been in this situation. He's often saying, oh man, this is really causing me a little bit of grief, a little bit of suffering. And they say, oh, that sounds pretty bad. Let's send you on for a test. And you go on for the test to have blood work or X-ray or whatever. And the specialist looks at that readout and says, oh no, you're fine, mate. You look good. This is nothing, it'll just go away. And you try to communicate across that gap where your experience of what your body is doing says that there's a real problem here. That person's image of what your body is doing says that there's not. Sometimes different diagnostic interventions can add up really nicely and paint a really coherent picture of what a person is, what a person can be. Other times they don't. And it's in those tensions when different activities produce different claims upon a body, different claims upon what that body could turn into, that the politics of medical practice happens, according to Moll. I think that idea can generalize really quite far outside of the hospital context that she's working in. The idea that when we start thinking about politics, the first question isn't actually what kinds of institutions structured this society. It's what kind of practices make claims upon the things that these people had, including their bodies, including their houses, including their fields and their dead, and so on. This ontological political way of looking at what happens in day-to-day practice highlights these moments of tension, these turning points where a body or a house is actually being enlisted in different political practices at one time, and there's a tension between what that same package of material could be, could become, could work as over time. And it makes material much more of a participant in our politics rather than simply being a reflection of our politics. To home. So what I want to do now is take a look at some of the Çatalhöyük houses that I looked at very, very closely for my PhD, and think about both what they could look like as political institutions in the more conventional sense of how we study, but also how they might look if we look at them through this different lens as being activated politically in practice. Let's see how I'm doing on time. just a little bit, but just in case, it is a very large Neolithic settlement, one of the largest Neolithic settlements in Southwest Asia. It's wetland part of the Central Anatolian Plateau. So Çatalhöyük is not, as often is written about in the press, a very early Neolithic site, the world's first city, etc. Settled life has been developing by the time Çatalhöyük is settled for more than 1,000 years, probably closer to 2,000 years in Southwest Asia. And broadly speaking, Neolithic lifeways develop quite dispersively over a large area. There's no kind of origin there. This is the big envelope in which Neolithic lifeways develop. Interestingly, though, kind of settled farming life doesn't seem to spread as it later did outside of the Middle East for quite a few millennia after it develops in the Middle East. Çatalhöyük kind of spans both geographically and chronologically that interesting turning point in kind of the big picture history where settled farming life just starts to expand outside of the kind of origin zone of it into some areas that had not been farming previously. So this is what Çatalhöyük looks like today. And if you look down into each of these kind of rectangular forms as a house, if you look down into it, or if you look down on that area, what you see is this. So it's a really radically dense cluster of mud brick houses. Every building excavated at the site with now 29 years of excavation has been, broadly speaking, a domestic structure and packed together wall against wall against wall on all four sides, mostly with very few and very small open spaces in between them. So people would have moved across the tell over the rooftops of houses and descended into houses by ladder from the roof. Estimates range from 1,000 to 8,000 people at a time living there. So really quite a big and a really dramatically dense way to make a town. If you look down into one of those houses, you'll see something that looks pretty good as a candidate with the household. So you come down a ladder from the roof into the corner here. This is pretty standard Çatalhöyük house. You have a little cooking area, kind of a kitchen, and then this checkerboard pattern of other areas in the house, elevated at different levels, broadly open plan, but with steps up and down all over the place. And these platforms might be devoted to storage area with grain bins, basins for grinding grain. Probably some of them are sleeping areas and areas to sit and do various activities. But you'll also have more interesting things like burials under the floor, paintings on the walls, sculptures sticking out of walls or out of the edges of platforms, and so on and so forth. Got vestigial text on the side. Ignore that. So like I said, Çatalhöyük houses make a pretty good candidate for the self-sufficient Neolithic household that is supposed to be well established by this point in Neolithic history. And so the conventional way to think about politics of Çatalhöyük, and there's been quite a lot of debate back and forth about it, is you've got the settlement plan. Each little architectural unit within it is, broadly speaking, a house inhabited by, broadly speaking, a household. And as I said, the question then becomes, which houses stand out? Which houses were special? Which houses maybe are beginning to lead or follow? Which ones are taking on more elite or less elite roles? And so this is just, I had this up before as well, this image from Ian Kite is broadly representative of a lot of the debate around Çatalhöyük. Is what he's done is taken a section of the site, each of them is a household, each building with a red dot in it has an oven, in which he's used as an indication that there's a household here because cooking is indoors and people are forming those bonds. And then he's shaded in buildings that look special in some ways because they have a lot of striking visual displays in them, or they have a lot of burials, or they have a lot of both. And he's tried to kind of group those houses together with the understanding that the special houses will have been kind of central to broader communities made up of non-special houses that are kind of organized around them. The problem with looking for special Çatalhöyük houses is that no one can agree on which ones the special houses are. So a lot of people have tried to come up with ways of identifying where the emergent inequality in Çatalhöyük society lies. And you don't have to absorb this table of data, but if you look at the colors I've shaded, the dark shading is the houses that this author would think is a special one. So Kite's criteria from the graph that I just showed you within this sample of houses would say these three are the special ones. Hodder's got a paper where the criteria he defines would say those two are both special, but so is this one. Leverhulme has one where he'd say that's actually a really special house in this set. And this is just counting a couple of criteria that people have come up with. So the bigger problem is, depending what you think could make a Çatalhöyük house special, you come up with a completely different set of buildings that jump out as the special ones. There's, broadly speaking, not a whole lot of correlation between, if you add up the burials in a house and try to correlate that with the flashy visual displays, that broadly doesn't correspond to one another. If you try to do a material wealth or symbolic status graph like this, you get no real overall pattern between it. And so these expectations that in Neolithic communities, we have sets of institutions, and we will see some of them emerging as the more wealthy ones or as the more prestigious ones, just isn't borne out by the data. And this is true at quite a lot of Neolithic sites contemporaneous with Çatal as well. With my PhD research was saying, what if the reason we can't get a really consistent pattern from one house to another at Çatalhöyük is because houses' roles in communities were variable in the first place, because houses didn't have definite political roles, but actually these were shifting. This was a great site to try out that perspective because of the unique nature of the archaeological remains, and particularly the extreme control that we have over time at Çatal. So people at Çatal plastered the walls and floors of their houses probably several times a year, and it projected these hundreds of houses. This creates an opportunity to look at how the interiors of houses changed in really, really fine detail. Again, some of these strata probably represent just a few months at a time. And so we can look at how different furnishings, ovens, hearths, burials, sculptures, exactly when in relation to the other features in the house did they go in. So broadly, my PhD worked from Harris matrices and the record of this stratigraphic sequence in a pretty good number of Çatalhöyük houses. This is what Çatalhöyük stratigraphy looks like in Harris matrix form. Each of these tiny little dots is a context. And in fact, that's about 20% of that building's matrix, because the full one wouldn't fit on this very large projector screen. The full site matrix, which does exist printed out in 9-point font, is about the size of this room. So we have a lot of stratigraphy, a lot of sequence information to work with. And actually this pushes the limits of what we have actually concepts developed to work with, because we have archaeological concepts and epistemologies developed for actually much coarser data than what we have to work with at Çatal, and a bit of a mismatch. So what I did for my PhD was develop methods that James Taylor, who's I think still in York, had started to develop to work with the full information embedded in these Harris matrices, and to develop time series data about what happens in Çatalhöyük houses, broadly speaking. I can answer questions about the method. I won't walk through the methodology. Maybe I shouldn't be so sure about some of the things that I'm saying from the basis of a Harris matrix. I'd be really happy to talk about how I come to some of the information that I'll be presenting here. But broadly speaking, it's a process of taking a Harris matrix and actually developing a relative timeline out of it, where you get a timeline of events in a house constrained by that stratigraphy so that things are broadly happening when assessment of when they happen relative to one another. So the raw output of that looks something like this. You, again, don't have to be able to read all of it, but this is a timeline running from the left to the right of the different features that are present in a particular. Blue things are burials, and roughly when those burials are being put in the floor. Lines, I'm colorblind, I'm guessing what color that is, but I think it's orangish, are hearths. So we can say, for example, based on the stratigraphy, that these burials went in while this hearth was in use, and so on and so forth. And what I started to find as I started looking at about a dozen or so of these Çatalhöyük buildings in detail is that they are much, much more dynamic than, again, the established kind of concepts and epistemologies in archaeology let us investigate. I thought I would walk through just one. So this is building 59 that you're looking at. It's a relatively normal mid-7th millennium BC house from Çatal, and we're kind of, the camera in the image is sitting up in the northeast corner looking back into the main room. So, like I said, you can see there's a little bit of a slashy scar on the wall in the very top left, crossing through the B, which is the ladder entry, or what's left of it. And then you have this big open plan room with a bunch of differently raised platforms. You've got a side room over just off the top of the screen that had at times kind of kitchen facilities in it, oven, hearth, basins for grinding grain, and so on. And then there's this had quite a lot of very large grain bins in it. So at what point in its life, this was probably a pretty eye-catching building. So in here, there's a very high platform in the northwest corner. It's got a couple of scars on the side of it. And when we found examples of these high corner platforms where the things on the flanks of them haven't been bashed off at abandonment, those are usually pillars with very large wild bull horns kind of flanking that platform. Most of these bullhorn framed platforms have quite a lot of dead people inside of them. This one only has this paltry little collection of rocks buried in the middle of it. But probably if you'd have walked into this building at a certain point in its life, there would have been this eye-catching display up in the corner. However, almost everything to do with that corner comes very late in the stratigraphy in the building, at least in the second half of the stratigraphy of the building's lifespan. For most of its life, the only kind of visual display in the space was a red painted panel along the east wall, which was refreshed a few times. Probably quite a lot of pigment and quite a lot of effort goes into this, but something a little bit less dramatic than what may have been in that northwest corner later on. The really interesting thing about Building 59 is in the kitchen, though. So when it's first built, there is an oven in the southwest corner. However, that's pretty quickly knocked out. And for most of the building's life, at least stratigraphically speaking, there is nothing in the building with which you could light a fire, cook dinner, do anything fire-related in the space. I said that there's quite a lot of storage in the building. That's all added quite gradually, and none of it is original to the space as well. So this ends up being the building at Çatalhöyük that has by far the most kind of what we think of as storage space for agricultural goods, but none of that was built into it initially. So it's only really in that final bit of the building's biography that it has visual display and a full kitchen put in the southwest corner again, and a bunch of storage bins. And a lot of the characteristic things that we think of Çatalhöyük houses having only come together in this space in the last years of its life. So when you look at a house biographically like that, a lot of the assumptions that we make about Neolithic houses start to come undone. If you sum up yeah, that makes sense as a Neolithic household, right? It's big enough to house quite a lot of people. It can store agricultural goods. There's one burial in the foundations of it. There's a hearth and an oven, places to grind grain, so on and so forth. But biographically speaking, not all of that is true at the same time. There are spans in this house's life where really important parts of Neolithic life, like cooking, are not possible given how that house is furnished. And that raises a lot of questions about what buildings at Çatalhöyük were supposed to do and how they were actually involved in people's lives. People are still using Building 59 while it is not equipped with a kitchen. They're still plastering the floors. They put in that very high platform that probably had horned pillars during that time. They're still doing stuff in the space, but no one was cooking anything in there. And I suspect that's not because the people who lived there didn't eat cooked food, but that they were able to meet those needs elsewhere using other buildings and the furnishings within them. So if we take all that information, that timeline, and just strip it down to look at how people might find a meal at Çatalhöyük. Like I said, we've got late in Building 59, two hearths, but there's this big gap in the middle where there's nothing in the building you can cook with. If we take data from a bunch of different buildings and look at it kind of comparatively, we can see that this is actually not that uncommon, particularly in the mid-7th millennium at Çatal. So here I've circled in red all the periods in these 12 buildings biographies where they don't have anything in the building. I've circled in blue periods where buildings have two, broadly speaking, kitchens in the house at the same time. So this baseline narrative that people move a lot of daily life into houses in the Neolithic, and that's what pulls a household together and bonds them into a unit, is a little bit more complicated than that, right? Finding a meal at Çatalhöyük was a little bit more complicated. Finding a place to get that meal from was a bit more complicated. You have buildings that have what seem like redundant cooking facilities. You have buildings that have none, and people are living in all of them. So if you think about the lifestyle of a person who lives in a house with no kitchen, as opposed to the lifestyle of a person living in a house with two kitchens, there's a bit more complexity to foodways at the site than appears if you just sum up houses as households. Likewise, I'm going to go through this quickly because I see that I'm getting on time. There's also interesting patterns to the flashy stuff that happens in Çatal houses. And one of the really flashy visual decorations, like in Building 59, actually go in very late in the building stratigraphy. So you can kind of look, if you cover up the right-hand side of that graph with your hand and just scan from top to bottom, the solid lines going across that graph are these kind of sculptural elements added on to the insides of buildings. And you won't encounter many of them going down the left-hand side of this graph. They're almost all in the later years of these buildings' occupation. And so if we look at Çatalhöyük houses in terms of the practices that they're involved in, they're much less stable sorts of social phenomena than we might expect. And we can also get a sense of some of the tempos and the dynamics of these practices, which ones were more durably fixed in place, which ones were really quite variable in where people were meeting their needs over time. So cooking and dining arrangements probably changed every few months to a few years. At least the role of a house in those arrangements changed quite quickly. Houses that are used for burial are often used for burial repeatedly, maybe about a decade or so, given the average life of a Çatalhöyük house is about 20 to 50 years. But it's rarely the whole span of that. Burial houses are not burial houses necessarily their entire life. And similarly with the visual displays, those seem to be especially concentrated in old houses. As each house gets old, it starts to accumulate these display elements. So the idea that when we look at that plan of the whole neighborhood at Çatal that I showed earlier, that what we're looking at is a set of households, and that by adding up the stuff inside them, we can try to understand the relationship between those households, like we're comparing groups of people by comparing houses, doesn't really quite add up. Çatalhöyük houses didn't have definite stable qualities. They were constantly being fiddled with, changed, turned into something that they previously weren't. And this almost never produced a kind of self-sufficient space that could meet a person's daily needs in whole. It seems like every person probably depended on quite a lot of different structures, quite a lot of different people, in order to just meet their needs as Neolithic people. And so that idea that you can use houses to stand in for sets or groups of people doesn't quite work for me with my data. And this is the point, I think, that I'm trying to make with houses that Mal was trying to make with bodies in a hospital. Most things are multiples. They're being enacted in multiple different practices with multiple different implications all at once. I like to think about these houses as kind of going through a process of tug of war where different stakeholders, if you want, are roping the house into practices that they're engaged in and shaping the house to their needs at the same time. And often this will be in tension with one another. Sometimes these things can nicely work together. Sometimes they really will contradict one another when people think about what a house could become. And so over time, the house, this is my attempt to graph that very abstract idea with colorful blotches, is over time, the physical form of a house is going to shift as it is roped into different political projects, different political practices by different groups of people who are all engaged in the same material stuff. Mal says that bodies are always more than one, but less than many. They're always part of more than one politically salient activity at once. But because they are also living organisms, they don't fall apart into a kind of relativistic blur of multiple things to multiple people. The multiple things that they are to multiple people intersect and influence one another and constrain one another and come into conflict. And that's what's interesting. That's what's political about bodies. And the same is true of these houses. So this is one of the ideas that I'm playing with as a way to start investigating a lot of different narratives that we have about the Neolithic and to try and restore a sense of kind of bottom-up political potential to them. So for the Leverhulme project that I'm just starting on in Leicester and we'll be working on for the next 3 years, I want to take a look at some of the practices that clue us into moments when people are mobile in the Neolithic. Not just mobile in the sense of actually packing up their lives and moving to Greece or whatever, although that apparently did happen to judge by some of the evidence, but also to look at more everyday moments of mobility when people close down a house and abandon a house. The people presumably don't stop living, they presumably go somewhere else. moments when houses are completely refurbished and turn to a completely different set of needs, implying that the people who are currently meeting their needs there might be depending a little bit differently on the built environment. Look at some of these practices that clue us into political tensions in communities that may have driven mobility during a time when the Neolithic is just starting to spread out of the Middle East and ultimately would set off a snowball reaction across much of Eurasia, turning us all into farmers. So with that very modest conclusion, I want to thank everyone for listening. Thanks to the Wednesday Seminar Committee for having me, and happy to answer questions. Yeah.
So if you're joining us from Teams, you are please free to type in your question into the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature like you do on a kind of old-fashioned Teams meeting. You can just speak your answer, unmute yourself and speak your answer. That will work too. Okay, anyway, well, yeah, open up the questions. So feel free to choose any questions out here.
Yeah, Deirdre.
I think that was about property. Where does property come into all of this? It seems to me that property is an important theme in identifying a household as an entity. It wasn't a word you used at all in your seminar, but I'm sure you go to detail that you can retrieve from the standard excavation and all that. And now, have you any thoughts about property?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's maybe an elephant in the room. I think property, for me, becomes one of those terms that we think we know what it means until we start to look at what we actually do with it. And particularly when we get to quite a foreign setting like the Neolithic, it becomes a real tricky idea to work with in terms of, for us, we have this difference between property and use that, say, between a landlord and tenant or whatnot. But both of those are legitimate claims on a house as well and recognized in our laws. So to try to understand property relations around, say, a house today, you would have to think about both what the law says about it, but also the kind of process of validating claims, the process of negotiating between stakeholders in a space, that kind of flies in the face of the assumption that there should be one clear-cut owner of just about anything. In practice, even in our own society where we have a very clear kind of emic concept of property, in practice it's much more complicated than that. At Çatal, my sense, and this is really just my sense, is that if you're living in a place where to even go to the latrine, you have to walk through 7 people's living space, that is not really a way of living that supports a concept of private property, the ability to deprive people of use of people more or less authorized to do things with a space. So I would probably start to think about property at Çatal by breaking it down into actual particular practices that may have given people a stake in an object or given them a stake in a house, and think about, okay, if your relative is buried below the floor in that house, but you rarely go there, what happens if you do decide to go and say you want to be buried next to them or something? I can't answer all of it, but I would probably start by breaking down the kinds of property claims or claims to access or use of things that people would make.
I think the concept of having use of a space is very helpful there rather than necessarily ownership. Exactly. And of course, we are long before anyone ever wrote down a piece of paper that says they did not do that. That doesn't mean that people in kind of
societies with oral record keeping can't have a concept of property, but probably it does work differently because the actual material practice of asserting property rights is different. Jose?
Thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. Really enjoyed that. I was very surprised by the question that you posed. Can a house age socially? That's very interesting because if a house is conserving time, it means that it's probably being renewed very often. So you will get the paradox that an old house, it's actually probably it's being renewed very often. So how would that work for you? I think this is just a very interesting, very striking concept. I don't have a real question about it. I just would like to know how that would work for you. What would it be?
At Çatal, it's a really interesting phenomenon that when houses are built, they are not generally very elaborate or visually striking. And it's only after they've been lived in for quite a few years that people start to put in those visual elaborations on the house. Some of them. Yeah, we're losing. Hold on. We're losing them. I'll continue, and hopefully the people at home can hear me, or they can ask me to repeat something. Yeah, so a mud brick building, if you keep refreshing the plaster cover on it, if you keep it out of the weather, it can last for a very, very long time. We have some that are pretty securely dated to be a century and a half. It's a very long time to keep a mud brick house going, but as you do that, there are also noticeable changes happen. So the longest lived ones do fill up with dead people. Go through them without popping someone open. And the plaster on the walls gets so thick that it starts to hang and actually wrinkle. I think there's something much more broadly in the Near East, and I won't go into this now, but there's a whole broad thing in the Near East of plaster and flesh being analogous, and they use plaster on houses, and they use it to model human flesh, like on skulls and whatnot. So an old house literally will have saggy, wrinkly plaster on the walls of it, and you can, as excavators, we get a pretty good sense of how old one is just when you expose it. You can kind of see it in the fabric of the house. So there's a lot of visual clues as to the age of a house, and they kind of accentuate that by putting sculptures in the walls and jutting out of the floors and whatnot. So physically it ages, and I think that at Çatal, clearly they mark that and accentuate that, and it becomes an important part of the social geography as well, that this house has been here for a very long time, has a lot of dead people in it. Would probably actually, because it's a tell and it's growing up and up, old houses would have been lower down and surrounded by higher houses. So yeah, it probably was actually quite palpable and dramatic how long a house had been standing for them.
Thank you. You have a question from Isabel?
Yes. So yeah, is it possible that people cooked on the roofs? It absolutely is. In fact, we know that it did happen at times. We are talking a part of the world with quite harsh winters and quite rainy springs, and certainly houses with kind of outdoor rooftop cooking facilities wouldn't have been useful in all weather if they didn't have something indoors as well. And we know that ones that did have indoor kitchens, those indoor kitchens were used very heavily. So it's absolutely possible that some of the patterns that I've described wouldn't be as dramatic, or maybe would be more dramatic if we had more examples of preserved rooftops on houses. As it is, we only get to know what's going on top of the houses when the roof kind of falls flat into the building and more or less holds together as it's demolished, which is a very small number of cases. But yeah, there is a whole second whole second story in multiple senses of the word to what's going on in the houses that I kind of skipped over for convenience. But yeah, good question.
I have a question, Kevin, as well.
Yeah.
You do a really amazing amount of stuff from specific layers from the houses. You talk a lot about houses. Is there any evidence of buildings that are not houses at Çatalhöyük specifically, and what is that?
Not really. So right towards the end, as the settlement is kind of interestingly withering down to a few small neighborhoods, a lot more space opens up, and then we get effectively separate structures for lots and lots of dead bodies and lots of engraved art and whatnot. So you get something like a specialized mortuary structure towards the very end of the 7th millennium. But for most of that millennium that the site is occupied, every building that we excavate is lived in some sense of the word lived in. Yeah, Ollie.
Thanks, Kevin. That was excellent. I've been trying to come up with a question all the way through, and I've got an outline of one that's been bugging me, I guess, a little bit. So the word ontology, which is in your title, obviously like a hugely contested word with a million different ways of employing it in our cultural theory. Nothing wrong with the way you've used it. But I'm struck by what kind of like Ben Alberti would respond to this, right? In terms of your use of ontology as opposed to his use of ontology, and when people use to talk about radical alterity, rather than the kind of multiplicity of Amory Moll or Brutus or anyone else of that kind of STS ilk. And I was thinking that it's when Jose was asking about houses that it kind of came to me. You've got these houses that are getting wrinkly and saggy and fading as they get older, and they're getting deeper, just like the older bodies are getting deeper and deeper and things like that. And therefore you could make this kind of interesting body pot style Ben Alberti argument about the relationship between bodies and houses, and how whatever house is a body in that the body is a pot type Ben Alberti equation. That's not a metaphor, it's not a synonym, it's a statement of fact.
Yeah.
And you can play with that. I'm just thinking about in my head about different ways to play that, which is quite interesting. But what struck me then is, I guess my question to you is, what would be the political implications of that? You know, because that's really missing from like a Ben Alberti approach to ontology. It doesn't have much in the way of politics attached to it. It's kind of an interesting world which opens up alterity and difference to us. Oh, that's fascinating. Alterity on one hand, and the politics that you talked about quite very eloquently in yours. You know, could we combine that when we think about what different politics are possible in a world where radical difference is at the heart of how people are living?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think that starting to do, and I think this isn't actually that dramatically different from the actual way Ben Alberti gets into it, even though my focus has been very different from his, is that starting to do ontology from practice, to do not actually as the kind of whole broad definition of it is what is there to be seen in the world, not starting from what is there to be seen, but what are people doing, or what are things doing for that matter, which is actually something like Ben Alberti classically. You've run into something that it just breaks your understanding of the world. Yeah, I don't think that's actually that different, that embedding of ontology in practice and encounter between what I'm doing and what Alberti is doing. I certainly think that there are political ramifications for thinking through the fact that there probably was some sort of conceptual analogy, more than a conceptual analogy, between the plaster people are using to coat their houses with and the plaster they're using to rebuild the faces on their dead relatives. There's certainly an implication of relationship that probably actually brings us back to Deirdre's question about property and what do we mean by this relationship between a person and a house. I imagine that was actually probably quite a lot different if you think of a house more as an organism, more as a body, and less as a house. And that probably would have impinged in a lot of different ways in terms of who's actually authorized to make changes to the house, who gets involved, who can you need to plaster this house. Probably to do it efficiently, you need about 15, 20 people is what experimentally it takes to plaster one of these houses. So you don't have 15, 20 people living in it day to day. How do you rope people in? Who gets roped into doing that? Who can make use of that house? We would think about all of that in terms of who has property rights or claims. Probably they thought about it a little bit more organically if they're thinking about the houses as more organic beings. So I think that plays a big role in actually how you mobilize a community if a house is much more organic. Radical alterity would make a political difference in Çatalhöyük society, but yeah, I think starting from practice is the important thing to me, and starting from moments of engagement rather than trying to say, okay, houses are monsters that are hungry for dead people or whatever.